What's up everyone? This episode will be all about mud and dust. And I also have a new rotating display. So let's talk first about the shape of this vehicle. If you look at the track and consider its rotation, you'll find out that the mud would go obviously this way. And obviously fall to the sides. My plan is to weather this tank as if it was active in summer of 1941. So most of the weathering will be dry earth with some tonal variations, but no fresh or wet mud, just some dried stuff accumulated over the time. The front of the tank would probably not receive much mud, but I think some dust would settle around the entire track. So let's start with the first step. Mud. I will use this acrylic mud from Wilder. I've been using it for years and the results this thing makes are just mwah. You'll see for yourself. It's acrylic, so I will blend it with water. But before we start, let's consider the placement of the mud. So the bottom should be pretty clean, maybe a few splashes here and there. And this should be the case up around here, and everything above will be about more and more mud, with the top portion receiving the thickest layer, because here it would naturally fall off the track, and then less and less towards the front. The support wheels would also throw some mud, but we need to keep in mind that they have mud guards. So why not start with them? So I'm starting very carefully, because I don't want to overdo anything. I'm just placing it at the edge of the mud guard and also on the side. Here I'm also being very cautious, because it's hard to fix any mistakes. So I like to start rather small if I'm unsure about the finished result. Note how I'm adding small amounts and then I immediately blend them with water. Then, as I'm moving toward the top, the amount of mud starts to get bigger, but it's still quite restrained, as I still don't have a clear idea about the result. Yet. The gun fixture would catch some falling mud as well. Let's place some larger clump here, and then as I move towards the front, I start to add less and less. Okay, the machine gun mount is an exception. That would definitely catch some mud. And here at the back, I'm again very cautious. I'm adding almost nothing. I mean, I'm adding something, but it's like the smallest amount on the entire model. The upper back portion is where the mud will slowly start to fall off and hit the hull. So I'm adding a bit more than on the lower part. And I'm also connecting it with the top portion. I hope this isn't getting confusing. And now I'm simply adding more random clumps at the top. The color of the mud paste makes it look pretty good on its own. I actually wonder how it would look if I just left it like this. The track requires a different approach, because I still have those two layers of chipping fluid somewhere down there, so I cannot use water to blend the mud. It would reactivate the chipping fluid and strip down everything on top of it, aka all the effects I made in the previous episode, and that would be totally not cool. So instead I'm just stippling the mud in small amounts. I'm using that tractor tire from the last episode as reference. You know, the muddy one. The thread pattern is, well, I have to keep in mind how worn down it is. There's almost none in the center. And the little that's left on the outside, that's where some small amounts would collect. You get the point. Let's now make some dust effects. The base paint will be again from Wilder. This one is enamel, not acrylic, so we will have plenty of time to blend it. The key is to simply paint each segment of the track, but to keep the center clean. The threads need to stay clean too, because they are in direct contact with the ground. And if this tank drove over, let's say, grass, the dust would rub off. Okay, we can keep the side walls a bit more dirty. Now I'm gonna use a larger brush for blending. This is fairly easy and you can see how the mud holds most of the paint, so be careful not to wipe away everything else. And then I cleaned the threads with a smaller brush. Oh, and don't forget the side walls. That would not look great. Now we need to let the dust dry for at least a day.
The next day.
Let's now enhance the dust with these dust deposits from AK. This is basically just pure pigment with thinner, so they are extremely matte, have a nice texture and also change color when they dry. I'm painting them mostly over the dried mud and also in the corners, but in small amounts. This product is quite powerful, as you will see later. Once again, I will blend them using a soft brush and thinner. See how they already started changing color? I cannot stress enough how important it is to let enamels dry for at least a day if you want to layer them on top of each other. If the previous layer wasn't fully dry, they would mix together into a messy finish. Okay, that looks quite interesting. Let's now repeat the same procedure on the hull. I'm covering every bit of mud and also painting the dust around the entire track. Blending will be a bit more difficult here, because the hull is glossy compared to the matte track. This is what the glossy surface will do. Most of the dust will be wiped away, while the mud will hold it and won't let go. This is a common thing with glossy surfaces, so I will have to add more after I'm done blending this layer. Although most of the paint gets wiped away, it will leave a small trace, which will reduce the glossy finish and it will make it easier to add and blend more dust. Now as I'm adding more, I'm using much less thinner in the paintbrush, because the paint is still wet. If you layer it like this in one session, the second layer will often damage or, let's be more fancy, reactivate the first layer. So you need to be prepared for that and simply fix any damaged areas while you are blending the second layer of dust. And I'm also adding some small amounts here, so that the rest of the tank doesn't look too clean. I also want to add some spilled fuel around the fuel caps, and fuel attracts dust, so I need to do that first. After leaving it dry for another day, I went over the dust with dust deposits. It's the exact same procedure as on the track. I normally don't use enamels for these effects. I prefer Miniart acrylics, but since this was my first time painting a ball-shaped object, I went with enamels, because it's easier to remove them if you make a mistake. Acrylics, once applied, are there to stay. Enamels usually produce different effects than acrylics, and I simply like the acrylic effects more. They are also less toxic, which is another thing I don't really like about enamels. Working on this model actually gave me a splitting headache because of the enamel fumes. So I'll be using them in more limited amounts on my future models. The dust deposits are also very easy to blend using a dry brush once the thinner evaporates. The last step was to add some tonal variation with these old wet effects from MIG Productions. The dust deposits get darker when they are wet, and this thing will do just that. I had to apply it in 2, sometimes more layers. The point here is to build up the effect without turning the earth into a glossy fresh mud, because this tank has to stay dry. Another great thing about slowly building up the effect is that you don't need to blend anything. The thin layers will create a smooth transition on their own. This is a truly fun technique because it's one of the last steps in the weathering process, which means you should be able to see the finished model at this point. In other words, it should be clear to you now if it's a good model or if you messed up the entire thing at some point. And that brings us to the end of this video. The last episode in this series will be about finishing touches. I'll do some spilled fuel and some metallic effects. Well, anyway, that's it for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you mates in the next one.